Today I'm going to be working with this book, Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions, edited by Thomas Arzt and Mary Stein. Thomas Arzt sadly died on Easter Sunday, and this teaching from his profound essay is an in memoriam to Thomas. And I just need to repeat for the YouTube audience that I'm going back to Man and His Symbols, which is the one book that Dr. Jung had written, or he wrote and had three of his colleagues write for laymen to help them understand what he was talking about. And I'm going to read from page 101 of the hardbound copy. If you want to get the hardbound copy, which is out of print, you probably need to buy a used version on Amazon, which is what I did. I was able to get 3 copies for $10 on used books. And I'm going to read this paragraph once again. As any change must begin somewhere, it is the single individual who will experience it and carry it through. The change must indeed begin with an individual. It might be any one of us. Nobody can afford to look around and to wait for somebody else to do what he is loath to do himself. But since nobody seems to know what to do, it might be worthwhile for each of us to ask himself whether by any chance his or her unconscious may know something that will help us. Certainly the conscious mind seems unable to do anything useful in this respect. Man today is painfully aware of the fact that neither his great religions nor his various philosophies seem to provide him with those powerful animating ideas that would give him the security he needs to face the present condition of the world. And so this teaching and everything on my YouTube channel is my idea of helping others in the world from an individual perspective, because I've felt that Dr. Jung's work has helped me very much over the last many years. And so I'm reading from Dr. Arzt's starting essay from Jung's Red Book for Our Time. I did the first segment of this essay last week, but so I'm going to go back to just a little bit that I covered at the end of last week so that you can have some context about what we're going to talk about. And so here's what he says. Edward Edinger's estimation, this condition of spiritual metaphysical homelessness, a state of being perhaps best captured in Nietzsche's Last Man or Martin Heidegger's They, has only deepened in later times. It is evident to thoughtful people that Western society no longer has a viable, functioning myth. Indeed, all major world cultures are approaching, to a greater or lesser extent, this state of mythlessness. The breakdown of a central myth is like the shattering of a vessel containing a precious essence. Meaning is lost. Now, just to comment on that, Dr. Jung felt that we have to have meaning in our lives. We have to have a way to find meaning. And in earlier times in the West, and I'm going to be using Western analogies and metaphors, so if you're not a Western person, you'll have to apply this to your own place. But what they mean by a container, what they're talking about here, is the idea that in the Christian church up until 1500, there was a container of a myth that people were working toward. In other words, they were working toward the kingdom of heaven and so on. And so that could release energies in the collective unconscious, which would get things done like building cathedrals. And so in Western Europe, for example, it would take 100 years to build a cathedral. And these buildings, and so it would be at least a 3-generational process, and everybody in the community would participate in it. And these buildings were used for many things. They were typically stone, and so they were quite structurally sound. And um, so for the villages that built up around these cathedrals, they were a place of security. So in terrible storms, people from the community could come into the cathedral for protection. They would have fairs around the cathedral, and sometimes in difficult times they would actually keep livestock in the cathedral, in the building, and it was all under God's plan, and everybody knew that. And because they had this psychological container in which they worked, and so they were all committed. All their physical energy went into that process. And so another example would be a country, a national boundary, for example. People would work toward building up their country and making it better. And so in Western Europe, you see these many little countries that developed in different ways. So the Italians are different from the Spanish, are different from the French, are different from the Dutch, are different from the Swedish, are different from the British. And and so and those differences are pretty dramatic from a cultural point of view. And in the United States, on the other hand, we didn't separate so much by culture because many different cultures were coming into the United States. And so in every place, there was a much larger mix of cultures. And obviously, we had many competitions between these groups. There's a famous movie called The Gangs of New York. And so there were rival people of various national backgrounds who would fight with one another. And we still have those things. And we have gangs all over the United States. But they tend to be much smaller than countries. And so over time, the reason the United States has risen above other countries, and there are a couple of measures. I guess one is the economy. We have the largest economy in the world, and so the reason that that's happened is that we have taken ideas from every group in the world. We have people who have come here from every country in the world. And initially, they tend to live in specific communities. And you still see that in the United States in some places. You see Chinatown and Koreatown and, areas that are devoted to the Muslim faith and so on throughout the United States. But over time, over 3 to 5 generations, people tend to become absorbed into the general community of the United States. And so, for example, I'm a 13th generation American. My first European American ancestor was born in 1588, and he came to the New World in 1625. And so there have been many generations since him. And so in my physical background, I have the Swedish, Welsh, German, and Dutch. And by German, I mean the Pennsylvania Dutch. So the guys that you see going down the highway with the horse and buggies, still 1/4 of my heritage comes from that. But me and my children are a mix of all those things. And so, so I have, among my 3 daughters, I have one daughter who married a man from English extraction, one that married a man from Korean extraction, and one that married a man from Irish extraction. And each of these families is quite different, but they're all quite American also in every way. But other countries maintained their consistency of the way they were. So even today, an Italian would seem different from a German type thing or an Irishman. And so, about 40 years ago, Europe tried to get together and mix things up. And so they have been doing that. That's a long-term project. It will take generations before Europeans see themselves as European as opposed to German or Italian. And but you can see how it works from a human being collective unconscious point of view, because the United States has become a magnet because of its strength. It has become a magnet. So we have people from every country in the world wanting to come here and be Americans. I don't think there's any other country in the world that can say that. And so ours is the system that seems to work for the collective overall. Now, there's always going to be, in the first generation, people who still speak the old country's language, who still think of themselves very much as a person of that society. But over time, that just gets diluted and diluted in multiple generations until, for example, my son-in-law, who is Korean American, he was born in Korea, but if you talked to him on the telephone, you would not be able to know what his ethnic origin is from a racial point of view, or from a national origin point of view, or from a religious point of view. He's just an American. And if you didn't physically see him, you wouldn't know that. Okay. And so this idea, and so when they talk about meaning, here, the meaning came from the container of the culture, whether the container was the religion, which released energy, released psychic energy, which built the cathedrals, and which built up the communities of Western Europe, or whether it's the community of the nation state, which before they used to be quite different, and they would war against one another. So the Germans fought the British and the Western Allies twice in world wars in the 20th century. And yet today, if you go and talk to a German, they pretty much sound like Americans in many ways. And their attitude is very much more like that. And so the point that we're talking about in this essay is that the human species is one thing, okay? And over maybe a couple of thousand years, the human species is going to recognize that. Some of us do recognize it now. Dr. Jung was one of the first that recognized it and recognized that there is an urge to get together. Now, it doesn't mean that there won't be fits and starts. For example, the Brexit debate in Britain, where conservatives wanted to say, oh, no, wait a minute, I want to be British. I don't want to be conglommed into this European Union. So I want to get out of the European Union. Well, that's all well and good, but the cow is out of the barn now. And if you go to Britain, you'll find that it's even more integrated than the United States, in the sense that there are many Indian Englishmen, Pakistani Englishmen, Chinese Englishmen who came from China or Hong Kong over the last couple of centuries, and so on. And so there was a consequence to Britain having this empire around the world at the end of the 19th century, which was that they had already brought these communities into the British Empire. And so now that's reflected in Britain itself. And so when the conservatives want to get out of the European Union because they don't want to be mixed in, at an unconscious level, that's what they're thinking. The reality is that they're already mixed in, and they're not ultimately, they're not going to be able to change it. And the world ultimately is going to look much more like the United States than like Britain, let's say, because they're trying to hold back. While here in America, we've been mixing for 400 years and we're still doing it. It's not going to stop. And it's a bloody process sometimes, as you see in the Black Lives Matter current affairs debate right now. But the reality is that we are mixing together. And hold on, I just have to admit another participant here. And so the point is this idea of a psychic container. So people could say, oh, I'm Singaporean, or I'm Australian, or I'm American, or whatever it is. Actually, we're just all human beings. And over many centuries, we're all going to mix together. And that, and so the issue was that in 1500, up until that time, the church had been the container. So everybody was working, putting their energy into God, who was out there, and so on. And so people could spend 3 generations building a cathedral and nobody thought anything of it. Today, if we build a building, we think if it takes 5 years, it's a long time. But in any case, the cathedral served as a central place and a place that helped the community, so everybody could put their energy into that. Now, in 1500, the scientific method came along, and it's called the Enlightenment, but I joke that it's really the Endarkenment, because it caused people to start to turn away from organized religion in the West, or specifically Christianity, because scientists started to blow holes in the Christian myth. And so Copernicus in the 15th century and then Galileo looked through their telescopes and they realized that the Earth wasn't the center of the universe for the first time. And it's probably true that Egyptian astronomers and others may have realized that 2,000 or 3,000 years earlier, but the records that we have now point to Copernicus and Galileo, and the church realized immediately that the fact that the Earth wasn't the center of the universe and wasn't, God's thing, would weaken the strength of the church as a political entity. And so they ran Galileo up before the Inquisition, and he would have literally been burned at the stake were it not for the fact that he decided to swear on a Bible, to put his hand on a Bible and say, the Earth is the center of the universe. But he knew that the Catholics kept good records and that he would make monkeys of the Inquisition for all time because they couldn't change the reality of where the Earth is in the universe. And so he put his hand on a Bible and he lied. And we have the abjuration of Galileo, which you can find on Wikipedia, where you can actually get what he said, but you can also see in what he said. And I'll just put it in the chat here because it's a difficult word, abjuration of Galileo. Okay, so Galileo knew that people in later days, he could keep his life, and people in later days would know that he was lying because he had written books about it earlier. So anyway, and he went on, that happened when he was 70, I believe. And he went on, he was already blind because he'd been looking at the sun for many years. So he couldn't see through the telescope anymore. And so he wasn't allowed by the Inquisition. He was allowed to live, but not look through a telescope. So he invented two additional sciences in that time, one of which was quantum physics. And so he was among the first quantum physicists. So Galileo started it, but scientists for the last 500 years have done it. And so the stories that were told in the church started to not have the same strength or the same container that they did. So by the end of the 19th century, Friedrich Nietzsche was able to say, God is dead and we have killed him. And who killed him was the scientific method. And so, as psychologists put it, God fell off the roof of the cathedral and into the psyche of man. And so then a new container has to develop. But the problem is the container, the religious container, contained our moral laws. For example, that thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery. Those sorts of moral laws were in the container. And so the result was that that people were cast adrift in the 20th century. And the result of that was, because there was no container, the result of that was 280 million people killed in the 20th century due to wars. And so now in postmodern times, we're even more adrift because now we do have the internet. We can interact with one another much more easily. And so all the culture pots in the world have holes in them. So if the culture pot held the meaning of your life, then the scientific method put holes in it, and then the opening up of the internet so that we can have this conversation across the world is a much bigger issue, because now everybody can see what we're talking about, and the fact that we need a container, and it no longer is holding up as nation states any longer. So what it means is that we as human beings have to find a new container in which we can put our psychic energy. And that container is very likely the fact that we all live in the same leaky lifeboat. And that is the planet Earth, and we're all dependent upon it. All life on Earth is dependent upon our Mother Earth. And so we all have to put our energy into developing a consensus about how we can cooperate in such a way that we don't destroy our home, because it's the only place we know that we can get to that can support our species and our children going forward. And the frightening thing, which Dr. Jung pointed out, is that now by rationality and the goddess of reason, we've been able to build up to the point where we can destroy the earth. We can destroy all life on earth as human beings. And so we need to find a way that we can regulate ourselves as the human species, such that we don't destroy the earth, because scientists disagree on how many nuclear explosions it would take, but the number is somewhere between 23 and 100. If there are between 23 and 100 nuclear explosions, we will create such a nuclear winter and such a haze over the earth in our atmosphere that all life on earth will die. And so that's why we cannot use nuclear weapons. And it's why we have to have people with enough maturity who are in control of the nuclear weapons, so that they know that and know that we can't. And so that's the background and the meaning. We have to find a new meaning, which probably no longer is a traditional religion. It's going to have to evolve from something else. And what Dr. Jung was saying by that quote from Man and His Symbols was that it has to come from the individual. So it has to come from people who understand the individuation process and who can make their contribution to the world in such a way that we don't destroy one another, because we all have base instincts. We all want revenge on someone, whether that's a sibling or somebody in another country. We all face these things, and we're all very competitive. Men and women are competitive for mates, for example, and that competition goes on throughout life, even after we're married. Even marriage doesn't hold up well anymore, and so the stories of politicians committing adultery are rife across society, and how does that get stopped? It gets stopped when we understand that we have to grow up. We have to understand what our spouse does for us, and how we can live together in happiness for 50 or 60 years, even though there are inevitable yin-yang style of debates going on in the marriage all the time. So from the marriage up to the nation state, up to the human species, we have these containers that we have to respect, and also learn how to facilitate things. So Dr. Arst's point in this essay, and I'm less than halfway through this essay. So far, he's just talking about meaning is lost, and when meaning is lost, then what's our life about? If our life isn't about building a cathedral for God, which also works to the benefit of your community, if your life isn't about that, then what is it about? And that's the great problem of our time. I have a visitor from Poland on the YouTube channel, which I appreciate. Okay, so I haven't even gotten up to the end of where we were last week, but let me read a couple more paragraphs now. So referring back to Jung's work, Edinger continues, and Edinger is writing about this in his book called The Creation of Consciousness by Edward Edinger. And he says, referring back to Jung's work, Edinger continues, as Jung's discovery of his own mythlessness paralleled the mythless condition of modern society, so Jung's discovery of his own individual myth will prove to be the first emergence of our new collective myth. So the individual myth is the myth of individuation, which Jung put basically on display, his own individuation process in the Red Book. Once you read that, then you understand what he was going through. But he said quite explicitly in the beginning of the Red Book, what I'm telling you is the way of this man, Carl Jung. I'm not telling you, I'm not a teacher to you. You have to find your own story, your own meaning to your life. And so, part of the meaning of my life, aside from being a good husband and so on, is the idea that Jung's ideas need to be expressed more broadly so that we understand what he did for us. And so you can find, I've done a reading, I understand that there are Jungian analysts who actually haven't read the Red Book, but I have read it multiple times, and I read it on video, and my reading of the Red Book is available on this YouTube channel. So if you have access to YouTube, you can listen to every word of the Red Book because I read it. And so you can do it while you're puttering around the kitchen or whatever. So, and so that's your myth. You have to think about what is the meaning of your life and what is your contribution going to be in the great mosaic of the human species. Is it going to be a net positive for that mosaic or a net negative? And so something like working for Brexit was a net negative because in the end, as Edinger said late in his life, the human species is ultimately going to be all one thing, or we're going to destroy ourselves. And obviously we have the ability to destroy ourselves now. And so the question is, how do we control those baser instincts that might let us destroy ourselves? How do we control those instincts? And then how do we start contributing to something which is better? So Edinger's statement is only understandable if one puts aside the discourse of academic sociologists, cultural theorists, and professional philosophers. So he's saying we have to ignore people who are theorists about this, and we have to decide for ourselves what the right thing to do is. And so opening up the sphere of individual core experience in the sense of Carl Friedrich Durkheim or Jung's experience of the self, one approaches the psychological, religious, spiritual, and metaphysical realms of life that are generally thought of to be off limits by today's modern academic establishment. So in other words, what Jung was talking about was looking back toward the soul, which is the self, the deepest part of our unconscious. We have to look back toward that and understand ourselves. And if we do that, that's a start. And so understanding what that means, in part, it relates to the 3.5 billion year old man or woman. All of us, every one of us, is the result of millions of ancestors going back to single-celled organisms. And so every one of those ancestors going all the way back 3.5 billion years have done two things successfully. They survived until they reproduced. They survived until they reproduced. And so that's what our ancestors have done. And the question now becomes, how does the human species survive and keep reproducing? And how does it extrapolate itself out into the universe, let's say? Obviously, we're at the very beginnings of those things, but what is the meaning then of human life? And part of the meaning of human life is that Dr. Jung pointed out that human beings are now, in effect, as far as we know, because we haven't found any other life in the universe, we are, in essence, God's consciousness. And, he points out that before the human species developed, there were creatures begetting and devouring for hundreds of millions of years. So it wasn't just God saying, presto changeo, now there'll be a zebra, and now there'll be a lion, and now there'll be an ape. It's not like that. Each one of them developed, and what his point is that those developments were the result of a pretty dim consciousness. Okay, it was energy, E equals mc squared. It was mass turning into energy and the energy of life. But it took hundreds of millions of years, in fact, billions of years, to make us. And so that's a pretty slow process. And up until us, there was no consciousness that it even existed. It just was a flow that just kept going back and forth and back and forth. And gradually it developed into us. Now we're conscious of it, and we can see our place in the universe, which does have meaning. We're the consciousness of the universe, or of God, or whatever you want to say. But Dr. Arst's point is that postmodern academic establishments don't even want to talk about that. And so then he has this statement, which I ended last week with, which is, nothing causes greater tedium and disregards the central questions of our time more than the ignorance and prevailing bustle witnessed within the self-referential and detail-obsessed chairs of our university institutions. In all likelihood, nothing revelatory will come from their discourse. So in other words, all these people are running back and forth, writing papers, jurying the papers, and they all are self-referential, and they're all trying to protect their little piece of the pie. And so they don't want to be pointing out some of the things that I'm pointing out to you today. They just want to say, oh yeah, this is my idea over here, and they don't even want to talk about things like the origins of religions. And one of the points that Dr. Edinger made is that Dr. Jung found the source of all religions. Okay, Dr. Jung found the source of all religions, but where is that being discussed in any university? We have two in the United States. One is Pacifica Graduate Institute, and one is Saybrook University, as I understand. But in universities, that's it. Aside from that, we have C.G. Jung institutes that train Jungian analysts, but those institutes don't have the power to make a licensed psychotherapist. Okay, you have to become a licensed psychotherapist through this university psychobabble, and after you do that and get licensed, then you can go learn to be a Jungian analyst, which is a step above that, but it's not accredited. And so, with the exception of, PhDs from Pacifica, for example. And so that's the problem. We have to start looking at these issues. And that's the point that Dr. Arzt was emphasizing in his essay. Okay, so now, I've made my point about where we are as of now. That's the beginning. So now, going on, this is new material from last week. It might be this near universal bypassing of the central questions of our present age that is globally driving an increasing interest in Jung. So his point is that people are more and more interested in Jung now because the universities aren't talking about it, and so they're not talking about the central issues of our age, like what is the impact of a Brexit? What is the impact of having an internet where everybody can communicate with everyone else? What is the impact of a country like Turkey that wants to cut people off from information? And, what's the impact of people in the United States who want to make the United States a Christian, quote unquote, nation? That's just not going to work, because the Christian pot that was the cultural vessel has holes in it, and so it cannot serve any longer unless we find a way to patch it up. And that's another thing that Jung found. And so the way I quip is that Nietzsche said that God is dead. Jung came along in the next generation and found the living God, where he lives and how he goes about doing the work of the Godhead. And so that's what I covered in my lecture last October, which you can find on this YouTube channel called Finding the Living God. And so I explained that in a 2-hour lecture, which I'm not going to redo here. But this is why Dr. Arzt feels there's greater interest in Jung. So the 21st century could be Jung's century, a century in which a postmodern state of mind and the demise of the secular conception of the human stimulates the intense search for sustainable alternatives to an epoch dominated by positivism, materialism, reductionism, and atheism. After all, in a spell of pneumophobia, modernity's enthronement of Déraison, the goddess of reason, led to an oppression of all phenomena of the spirit and or of the sacred. Subsequently, the spirit, as well as the anima mundi, according to Nobel Prize winning physicist Wolfgang Pauli, has disappeared into the unconscious. And so, what we don't understand is the Spirit and the Holy Spirit and how it makes us do things. We can't control what it is we're going to be doing 2 minutes from now. That all comes from the unconscious. So if you think that you can imagine exactly what you're going to be doing 2 minutes from now, just think about it. Probably you can't. You're going to be doing something different from what you thought. And so the spirit is leaking through. Okay. There are yoga teachers in Nebraska that are talking about the spirit in a very interesting way. And yet we don't recognize that. And the issue is that the goddess of reason took us just so far, but now we have to understand the rest of our life, which is our spirit and soul. Sorry. Okay. So, I was talking about what postmodernism was last week, and there was a definition of that. So if you haven't listened to last week's talk, these special talks that I'm doing at 8 a.m. Eastern time, US Eastern time, but this same time wherever it is you live, part 1 was last week, in which what postmodernism was described. So now going on, Jung describes this process in The Spiritual Problem of Modern Man. That's the name of a Jung essay, which is a book in itself, The Spiritual Problem of Modern Man, as follows. Whenever there exists some external form, be it an ideal or a ritual, by which all the yearnings and hopes of the soul are adequately expressed, as for instance in a living religion, then we may say that the psyche is outside and there is no psychic problem, just as there is no unconscious in our sense of the word. In consonance with this truth, the discovery of psychology falls entirely within the last decades, although long before that, man was introspective and intelligent enough to recognize the facts that are the subject matter of psychology. So also, a spiritual need has produced in our time the discovery of psychology. The psychic facts still existed earlier, of course, but they did not attract attention. No one noticed them. People got along without them. But today, we can no longer get along unless we pay attention to the psyche. So the point is that, when you're building a cathedral and all your energy is going into building the cathedral, and as it's going up and it's quite beautiful, you're quite satisfied with that. So when all your energy goes into that, then you don't have to sit at home and say, I don't know if my life is okay type thing, because you have a meaning to your life. But if you lose that, if you don't have something that's going to spiritually drive you, then then you can get really depressed and so on. And that's what psychotherapy does. But as you see on this YouTube channel, because I've created more than around 1,100 videos since June the 1st, 2016, my spirit has been driven to express this information to you, the audience, and help you to see what's going on in the world, because it's happening on a global basis. And so Dr. Jung's point is that each of us must go back and look at ourselves internally and examine if we know something that can help change the world, so that we understand that, oh, by the way, we're all living on this leaky lifeboat, which we call the earth. And if we don't take care of it, there isn't going to be a human species in the future. And so that's the fundamental issue. And in order to survive that, we have to understand ourselves first from a psychological point of view, and the need for us to control our own spirit. William Baker says, doesn't the self demand a dedication and a suspension of skepticism in order for it to work and help our individuation, allowing ourselves to an extent to be engulfed by it with all the risks? Well, that's certainly true. And all I'm saying is there's simply no question that it's there. Okay, we don't control our lives. Our self controls our lives, and we either learn how to ride that horse, or we're simply going to get bucked off of it. And all you have to do to understand the truth of that is just know that you don't know what you're going to be doing 2 minutes from now. And but the point is that the self is this part of us that developed over the last 3.5 billion years inside us. It's kept us alive through all of that time, and through all of our ancestors, so that just the simplest examples, our heart beats 72 times a minute, our lungs breathe 12 times a minute. Try doing that consciously or without, or consciously stopping it. You can't, okay? You can't do it. You hold your breath for 2 minutes, and most people are near asphyxia. So you can't willfully control what the self is doing. The self is going to cause you to breathe. And you can hold a pillow over someone else's face and cause them to suffocate and kill them by being willful. You can do that, but chances are you can't kill yourself by holding your breath. Your psyche simply is not going to allow you to do that, and so and you can't stop your heart. you wouldn't want to. And so our self also replaces every cell in our body, with the possible exception of brain cells um, and skeleton, um, throughout our lifetime. You know, your hand, your heart are all new cells that were made in the last 7 years. And so your psyche is doing that for you. And so, you know, that's just at the crudest level. We're saying that those things are yourself acting. Now, dreams and visions are also yourself, because yourself is trying to give you messages. That's how it communicates. It developed before there was language. So although sometimes in a dream you can hear an ex cathedra voice saying, you know, thou shalt do such and such or something like that. But normally what you have in dreams and visions is an image, because the images existed long, long, long before there was language. And so, you know, we have an image of a cat, for example, and, you know, cats were a predator in early ancient times, pre-human times. And so we're afraid of cats. So one of the reasons that humans love cats, little ones, is because we can control that fear. If we have a cat and we say, oh, okay, we can control that, then the image of a big cat attacking us isn't so fearsome, because we know, oh, good, that cat is not here in my house. I have this little cat that I can control. And so it gives you a sense of control of your life, you know. And the same is true of dogs. You know, dogs were domesticated from wolves, and, you know, but before 15,000 years ago, wolves were a fearsome species for human beings, and they were eating us. Nowadays, that's pretty rare, but they still exist. So anyway, so Ars goes on. Du se retire. Nonetheless, one has to follow God. Okay, now God being in the Jungian context, the God image of the self and the God image of the collective unconscious. Okay, so one has to follow God. According to the view of German writer Ernst Junger, hence, the engagement with the unconscious becomes a vital necessity, not only for the individual, but for the social collective, since it has become a matter of survival. Ironically, the historic moment of the proclamation of the iron cage by sociologist and philosopher Max Weber coincided with the beginning of depth psychology, perhaps an unexpected cunning of reason. From the perspective of Jung's understanding of the evolution of human consciousness, the project of modernity could only lead to a darkening of the world. Okay, so so the point is that the iron cage is all the rules that we've put into the human species, all our laws that we've created and our judges and all of that. And as long as everybody goes by those rules, everything is hunky-dory. But if people start to ignore those rules, then everything is going to fall apart. And so we have an example of the possibility of that with our current president, because the current American president simply ignores all the rules, and he's the poster boy of materialism. So he's managed by hook or crook, however he's done it. He's managed to get buildings built in his name. He's managed to become one of the wealthiest people on the planet. He's gotten 3 trophy wives, and he's managed to become president of the United States. So those are all materialistic objectives, the god of materialism. Um, but is that man happy? That's a question. You know, if you get everything that you want from a physical point of view, uh, does that give you happiness? Okay, my argument is that it doesn't, and he's the proof of it, that he's managed to get whatever he wanted by hook or crook, or you know, maybe he's done it totally legitimately. But the problem is that it doesn't bring happiness, and because materialism doesn't lead to happiness. So I often share this one photograph, and I'm going to share it here again. People who are familiar with me and my talks will probably be bored, but if you haven't seen my talks before, this picture also reflects it, because this is a 64-foot motor yacht that this owner has. And so he had this dream of having a bigger and bigger boat, but he's written on the transom of his boat, the name of his boat is Never Enough. And the point is that you can chase materialistic objectives all you want, but you're never going to have enough. And so the question is, how do you live a life that's enough? And my point is that everything that's material, everything that you can see in this picture, because there are no human beings in this picture, is everything that's been constructed in this picture, not the trees, because the trees are life, but everything else is dead. Okay, everything that is a material thing is dead. And the question is, how do you live your life in such a way that you are spiritually moved, that your soul is moved, and recognizing that everything in the room in which you sit, everything except human beings and potted plants and maybe a pet or two, everything else is a material thing for which we need the logos. We need the logos 100% to create all of those things, but all of those things are dead. They are not alive. And so the question is, what is it that you bring into your life that makes you alive and feel alive and move forward with your life, that generates energy, psychic energy within your psyche to do things? And that's what Jung was talking about. How do you generate that psychic energy? And that is all done through the eros, through the sacred, through the things that are irrational. They're not rational. Okay, they're not rational, because happiness doesn't come from being rational. Happiness comes from a balance between logos and eros. So it's not wrong to have things. We all need things. You need the computer that you're looking at right now in order to live, and in order to communicate about Jung. But the issue is that we also need a life. And so unfortunately, men tend to be very rational. And so they're always trying to get things like a bigger boat, let's say. But in the end, at the end of their life, can they look back and say, that thing brought me happiness? Or was it your wife and children that brought you happiness? Was it the way you interacted with people in the world that brought you happiness? Or the way you interacted in the world got you killed? That's the other side of it. So, so that's the point that Dr. Arzt is talking about. So then Dr. Arzt quotes Heidegger. He says, for all ages before us, and so this is Heidegger speaking now, for all ages before us have believed in gods in some form or other. Only an unparalleled impoverishment of symbolism could enable us to rediscover the gods as psychic factors, that is, as archetypes of the unconscious. Since the stars have fallen from heaven and our highest symbols are paled, a secret life holds sway in the unconscious. That is why we have a psychology today and why we speak of the unconscious. All this would be quite superfluous in an age of culture that possessed symbols. Symbols are spirit from above, and under those conditions, the spirit is above too. Therefore, it would be a foolish and senseless undertaking for such people to wish to experience or investigate an unconscious that contains nothing but the silent, undisturbed sway of nature. Our unconscious, on the other hand, hides living water, spirit that has become nature, and that is why it is disturbed. Heaven has become for us the cosmic space of the physicists, and the divine Imperium a fair memory of things that once were. But the heart glows, and a spirit and a secret unrest gnaws at the roots of our being. And so the point of this is that within all of us is some discomfort with where we are that's gnawing at the roots of our being. And we need to examine ourselves and try to understand what is pushing us, what is making you watch this video, for example. All right, so now I have a life, and in my life, I have a physical need to take a few moments off. So I'm going to step away from the camera for a few moments, and I will be back in less than a minute. So that was a very clear object lesson, in that my spirit was telling me for several minutes that I needed to take a bio break, and it's quite embarrassing to need to do that, but we are living creatures, and things that we don't control require us to do certain things. And so if we learn how to control our minds, we're better off, because although, it would be quite embarrassing for a speaker at a podium to say, wait a minute, I have to take a minute off. But the reality is we all have to take a minute off from time to time. And so that's the way it works. So, William Baker says, thank you, Dr. Arzt. Doesn't the self ask for our conscious consent to an extent? It doesn't ask for our conscious consent. Or, okay, it asks my conscious consent to take a bio break, but if I didn't take the bio break, it would still give the result, except I would be sitting in a pool of you know what. And so he says, how do we do that? Just through a dialogue with the unconscious. Well, first of all, you need to accept that you have an unconscious and that you have internal processes that are expressing themselves to you all the time. And one of the things that you need and require that your soul needs is a meaning to your life. And your spirit is going to guide you on what that meaning can be, but you need to be sensitive to it. So this is why creativity is very important. So what I say to people is decide that you're going to have some creative hobby. It doesn't matter what it is. It could be modern dance, it could be opera, it could be singing in the shower, it could be woodworking or cooking or painting or sculpting. This house behind me is Dr. Jung's house that he built with his bare hands creatively. And he did many other things. If you're familiar with the Red Book, you know that he did a lot of painting. He did calligraphy. He did many things from a creative point of view, because those creative things are caused by a need of your soul, and I can't say what that need is, but a need of your soul, which is manifested through the spirit. And so the best way to hear and know what that is to pick any creative activity you want. I'll give you a few examples, but let's say it's painting or sculpture or woodworking or cooking. All those things are creative activities. Now, pick any one of those or any other, it doesn't matter, but if you pick any one of those, let's say, and so if you pick painting and sculpture, you would go to your local art supply store. Go into that art supply store and just walk up and down the aisles, and something will speak to you. There'll be some product there for sale, whether it's clay or whether it's paintbrushes or whether it's, it could be macrame or something like that, that, you just feel that you're drawn to that thing. Whatever that is that's causing you to feel that, that's your soul telling you that. Okay, the same applies to woodworking. You go to the tool supply store. It used to be Sears. I don't know if it still is, but in America, we would go to the Sears tool department, and mostly men would do this, and you'd walk up and down the aisle and you'd say, wow, I need that circular saw, or I really wish I had that drill press. And so that's your soul telling you to move in that direction. Now, if you're a cook or a chef and you're drawn toward cooking, you can go to the kitchen supply store and see which items attract you. It could be a pan for making omelets, or a device to make a waffle, whatever it is. Pick that thing, whatever it is, in any of those locations, and take it home and start to work with it, whatever it is. Now, as you go forward, your spirit is telling you how to do things, and it doesn't matter if it's awful to begin with. In other words, if you don't think you can paint a picture, then you're wrong, because you can. And it doesn't have to be a neat, prissy little picture that that passes for a photograph. We have cameras for that these days. You don't need a perfect image. So, you know, I'll just show you. Let's see, where is it? Okay, so I'll just show you a painting I did. Okay, and this is a painting. I did this painting. As you see, it's not a perfect painting in any sense. Um, and I did this with a palette knife only. I didn't touch it with a brush. It's a self-portrait of me in Vietnam 50 years ago. And but in this painting, and specifically in the white of my left eye, I've said everything that